Colonel James Wilson never intended to become the center of national attention that evening. As he adjusted his dress uniform in the small bathroom of the community center, he ran through his mental checklist one more time. His medals were properly aligned, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, habits that 25 years of military service had ingrained in him. 2 minutes. "Colonel?" called a production assistant through the door. James nodded at his reflection. He was here simply to represent veterans in the audience, not to speak. The town hall format would allow pre-selected citizens to ask President Trump questions, and James wasn't on that list. That was fine by him. At 52, he'd learned that listening often accomplished more than talking. The town hall was being held in Philadelphia, a strategic location given Pennsylvania's swing state status in the upcoming election. The community center's main hall had been transformed by production crews, with professional lighting, a small stage and seating for around 200 carefully vetted attendees. American flags flanked the stage where a lone podium waited for the president. James took his assigned seat in the 4th row, nodding politely to the woman beside him. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, camera crews making final adjustments while the moderator, a well-known network anchor, reviewed her notes. Security personnel scanned the room continuously, their earpieces occasionally lighting up with communication. "Pretty exciting, isn't it?" The woman next to him smiled. "I'm Helen Brooks. My husband served with the 82nd Airborne." "James Wilson," he replied, shaking her hand. "Army, retired last year." "Those are quite the medals," Helen noted. "Afghanistan?" "3 tours," James said simply. He never elaborated unless asked directly. The memories of Kandahar and the friends he'd lost there still visited him in quiet moments. The lights dimmed briefly, signaling the broadcast was about to begin. James sat straighter as the network's familiar theme music played, and the moderator welcomed viewers across America. Tonight, in this special town hall event, citizens will have the opportunity to directly address President Donald Trump on issues that matter most to them, she explained. Our audience consists of voters from across the political spectrum, all with important questions about the future of our nation. When President Trump entered from stage right, the room erupted in applause, though James noticed it wasn't universal. Some, like himself, offered respectful acknowledgement without enthusiasm. Others remained seated, hands folded in their laps. America's divisions were visible even in this carefully orchestrated setting. The president began with prepared remarks about the economy and national security, occasionally deviating from his teleprompter with familiar phrases that had become his political signatures. James listened attentively, his face neutral despite the internal conflict he felt. He had served under 4 commanders-in-chief without letting politics affect his duty, but this president's comments about military service had sometimes cut deep. The first 3 questions from audience members covered healthcare, immigration, and foreign policy. James observed how Trump responded differently to each questioner, warm and engaging with supporters, more defensive with those he perceived as critical. It was a masterclass in political communication, regardless of one's views on the content. The moderator's voice broke through James's analysis. "Our next question comes from Colonel James Wilson, a decorated veteran with 25 years of service, including 3 tours in Afghanistan." James blinked in surprise. He wasn't supposed to be on the list. His heart rate quickened as a production assistant approached with a microphone, and suddenly every eye in the room, including the president's, turned toward him. Standing slowly, James took the microphone. He hadn't prepared anything, but decades of military briefings had taught him to think clearly under pressure. He decided simple honesty was his only option. "Good evening, Mr. President," he began, his deep voice steady despite his surprise. "I didn't expect to speak tonight, but since I have the opportunity, there's something I feel needs addressing. I've dedicated my life to serving this country, as have millions of my brothers and sisters in uniform." James paused, noticing the president's expression shift slightly. The room had gone completely silent. "In recent years, I've heard you make comments about those who've served, particularly about prisoners of war and those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Comments suggesting that those captured in combat are somehow less worthy of honor, or questioning why people would serve when there's nothing in it for them." The president shifted his weight, a flash of recognition crossing his face. The moderator looked uncomfortable but didn't interrupt. I've held friends as they died on foreign soil. Mr. President, I've written letters to parents explaining why their children weren't coming home. There were indeed days when many of us asked what it was all for. James's voice remained measured, but emotion ran just beneath the surface. But we served anyway because we believed in something larger than ourselves. James could feel the tension in the room, the cameras tracking his every word. He hadn't planned this moment, but now that it was happening, he felt a responsibility to the men and women who had served alongside him. My question is straightforward, sir. When you hear veterans express concern about such comments, do you understand why they might feel disrespected, regardless of your intention? And more importantly, how would you reassure the young men and women currently in uniform that their sacrifice is valued beyond political talking points? The camera panned to the president, whose expression was unreadable. The moderator seemed about to intervene, perhaps sensing the delicate nature of the exchange, but Trump raised his hand slightly, indicating he wanted to respond directly. For a moment, the entire nation held its breath. James stood tall, not in defiance but in dignity, his question hanging in the air between them. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was merely seconds. In newsrooms across America, producers were already preparing graphics for what promised to be the headline moment of the night. On social media, clips of James's question were already being shared, commented on, and debated before the president had even responded. James noticed subtle changes in the president's demeanor, a slight softening around the eyes, a momentary drop of the public persona. For just an instant, there seemed to be genuine recognition passing between two men who, despite vastly different paths, were both Americans grappling with the nation's complex identity. The Secret Service agents at the edges of the room had tensed slightly, though James's respectful tone and straight posture clearly indicated he posed no threat. The moderator glanced at her producers off camera, uncertainty written across her face about whether to allow this unscripted moment to continue. In the audience, phones were raised to capture what was happening. Despite the rules against recording, Helen Brooks beside him had tears in her eyes, her hand instinctively reaching to touch the gold star pin on her lapel that James hadn't noticed earlier. James remained standing, his years of military bearing evident in his posture. He wasn't challenging the president as a political opponent, but speaking to him as a citizen addressing his commander-in-chief. The distinction was subtle but important, and those with military experience in the room recognized it immediately. What happened next would be replayed on news networks for weeks, analyzed by political commentators and discussed in veterans' halls across America. The president's response, so different from his usual defensive reactions to criticism, would spark debates about authenticity in politics and the complex relationship between civilian leadership and military service. But in that moment, before anyone knew what would happen next, James Wilson stood alone, a solitary figure in decorated uniform, having spoken not just for himself but for countless others who had served. He had not raised his voice or made accusations, but simply asked for acknowledgement of a reality that transcended political divisions, that service and sacrifice deserve respect, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. The nation watched, millions holding their breath, waiting to see if this unexpected confrontation would devolve into another partisan battle or if, perhaps, it might offer a rare glimpse of common ground in an increasingly divided America. The president leaned toward his microphone and began to speak. The president leaned toward the microphone, and for a moment his familiar confidence seemed to waver. The studio lights caught the beads of sweat forming at his temples. This wasn't in the briefing folder his staff had prepared, an unvetted question from a decorated veteran about comments that had dogged him for years. "Well, first, Colonel Wilson, thank you for your service," Trump began, his tone notably different from the booming campaign voice he'd used moments earlier. 25 years, 3 tours in Afghanistan. That's something. That's really something. The audience remained silent, sensing they were witnessing something rare in modern politics, an unscripted moment with real stakes. The network producers, initially panicked by this deviation from the planned questions, now held back from cutting to commercial. Ratings were about to skyrocket. Trump shifted his weight, his eyes moving from the teleprompter, now useless, back to James. "You know, when you're talking to different crowds, different people, sometimes things get said. The media, they take a piece here, a piece there. He waved his hand dismissively, falling back on familiar patterns. But then something changed in his expression. Perhaps it was the way James stood there, not with anger, but with dignity. Or maybe it was the unmistakable weight of the medals on his chest, tangible evidence of sacrifice that couldn't be spun or denied. "But I hear what you're saying," Trump continued, his voice lower. "I hear it. And maybe sometimes in the heat of everything, words don't come out right." The moderator looked stunned. Backstage, campaign staffers exchanged glances, unsure whether to be alarmed or relieved. This wasn't the combative response they'd expected. "Look, I love our military, everyone knows that. I've increased the defense budget tremendously. Tremendously." Trump was regaining his footing now, but still speaking directly to James rather than playing to the cameras. "But you're talking about something different, aren't you? You're talking about respect." James gave a single, subtle nod. The president stepped out from behind his podium, a move that caused his Secret Service detail to tense visibly. Protocol dictated he stay in position during these events. But Trump had never been one for protocol. "Could I see your medals more closely, Colonel?" he asked, surprising everyone. The moderator finally found her voice. "Mr. President, perhaps we should move on to the next." "No, I want to see them," Trump insisted, already moving toward James. The room collectively held its breath as the President of the United States walked down the short set of stairs from the stage and into the audience. Camera operators scrambled to adjust their angles, network directors frantically switching between shots to capture this unprecedented moment. James stood his ground, neither stepping back nor forward as Trump approached. The height difference between them was noticeable, James towering a good 6 inches over the president. "These are impressive," Trump said, genuine curiosity in his voice as he examined the medals. "This one? What's this one for?" "Silver Star, sir. Kandahar Province 2010. You saved people?" "I did my job, Mr. President. We all did." Trump nodded slowly, seeming to process this. A camera caught the moment in perfect focus. The president, looking up at the veteran. Two Americans from entirely different worlds having a conversation that suddenly felt private, despite being broadcast to millions. "I'm going to tell you something, Colonel," Trump said, his voice lower now but still picked up by the microphones. "I didn't serve. You know that. Bone spurs. That's the story." He shrugged slightly. "Maybe I don't always understand what it means, all of this." He gestured vaguely toward James's uniform. The audience was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their seats. Even the normally impassive camera operators were transfixed. "But I respect it," Trump continued. "I do. And if something I said made you or others who wore that uniform feel like I don't, well, that's not good. That's not what I want." James's expression remained measured, but something in his eyes had changed, not softened exactly, but acknowledged. "Thank you for saying that, sir." For a moment it seemed like that would be the end of it, a surprisingly human exchange that would be analyzed for days. But then Trump did something else unexpected. He extended his hand to James. "I want to hear more about your experience. Not now, but soon. Would you be willing to visit the White House, bring some of your fellow veterans? I think I need to listen more on this one." James hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake. "Yes, sir, I would." As their hands clasped, camera shutters clicked frantically. News directors across the country were already planning their headlines. "Unprecedented. Trump extends olive branch to critic," or "Dramatic confrontation leads to surprise invitation." But the reality was more nuanced than any headline could capture. This wasn't politics as usual. It was a moment of genuine human connection that had somehow broken through the carefully constructed walls of modern political theater. As Trump returned to the stage, the audience finally exhaled. The moderator, recovering her composure, tried to steer the town hall back to its planned course. "Thank you, Mr. President. Let's move on to our next question about healthcare policy." But the energy in the room had fundamentally changed. Viewers at home could feel it too. The carefully choreographed political dance had been disrupted by something authentic, and nobody, not the campaign strategists, not the media analysts, not even the participants themselves, quite knew what to make of it. James sat down, aware of the eyes still on him. Helen Brooks beside him whispered, "I've never seen anything like that in my life." James hadn't either, and he'd seen a lot in his years of service. As the town hall continued, with Trump now answering questions about health care with renewed focus, James found himself replaying the exchange in his mind. He hadn't come here expecting to speak, let alone to have the President of the United States approach him personally. He certainly hadn't expected what felt like a genuine moment of reflection from a man known for doubling down rather than reconsidering. Was it political theater? Perhaps. James was too experienced, had seen too much of the world to be naive. But there had been something in Trump's eyes during those few minutes, something unscripted, something real. And in today's climate, maybe that counted for something. Outside the community center, a crowd had gathered. Supporters, protesters, and media. News of what had happened inside was already spreading through social media, with hashtags forming and commentators rushing to frame the narrative before it could form organically. Inside, as the town hall drew to a close, Trump made his concluding remarks. He thanked the audience, the moderator, and the network. But then he added something that wasn't on the teleprompter. "And I want to thank Colonel Wilson for his directness tonight. We don't always have to agree in this country. That's not what America is about. But we do need to listen to each other, especially to those who've put their lives on the line for all of us." As the broadcast ended and the lights changed, signaling they were off air, the real political machinery kicked into high gear. Aides rushed to the president's side, some looking concerned, others intrigued by this unexpected development. The media began shouting questions, trying to get reactions from audience members as they exited. A young aide approached James as he was preparing to leave. "Colonel Wilson, the president asked me to give you this." She handed him a business card with a direct White House number handwritten on the back. He meant what he said about the visit. "Call this number tomorrow to arrange it." James pocketed the card, nodding his thanks. As he made his way toward the exit, people reached out to touch his arm, to thank him, to share their own military connections. What had begun as a simple town hall appearance had somehow transformed into something else entirely. Outside, the evening air felt crisp after the stuffy heat of the television lights. News vans lined the street, reporters already delivering breathless accounts of what they were calling the handshake that shocked America. James slipped past them, not interested in becoming the story. But as he walked to his car, his phone buzzed continuously with notifications. His quiet life had just become very public, and he knew that by morning everything would be different. What he didn't know, what no one could know yet, was just how far the ripples from this unexpected confrontation would spread, or how it might change the national conversation in ways both subtle and profound. James's phone rang at 5:30 the next morning. He'd been awake since 4 as the old military habits dying hard, especially on days when his mind was unsettled. The number was unfamiliar. "Colonel Wilson speaking," he answered, voice clear despite the early hour. "Colonel, this is Diane Reynolds from Good Morning America. We'd love to have you on the show this morning to discuss your exchange with President Trump." By 6:15, he had declined requests from 3 morning shows, 2 radio programs, and a major newspaper. His voicemail was full. His email inbox had exploded. Overnight, the video of his exchange with the president had been viewed 20 million times. James stood at his kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the dawn break over his modest suburban home. The garden needed attention. Retirement had given him time for hobbies he'd neglected during his years of service. But gardening would have to wait. A news van had just parked across the street. His doorbell rang 30 minutes later. He'd been expecting it, had even put on a pressed shirt and slacks rather than his usual weekend attire. Opening the door revealed not reporters, as he'd anticipated, but 2 men in dark suits. "Colonel Wilson?" "Secret Service. The President has requested your presence at the White House this afternoon at 2 p.m. We're here to escort you, sir." James raised an eyebrow. "Today? I thought we were going to arrange something for next week." The agent didn't blink. "The president's schedule has been adjusted. There's a car waiting." 3 hours later, James found himself being ushered through security checkpoints at the White House. The process was efficient but thorough. Fingerprints, ID verification, metal detectors. He'd been here before, years ago, to receive a unit commendation from a previous administration. But this visit felt entirely different. "The president is finishing a call with the Japanese Prime Minister," explained a young aide as she led him through corridors lined with history. "He's asked to meet you in the Rose Garden rather than the Oval Office." Less formal. As they walked, staff members glanced at him with undisguised curiosity. News of his invitation had clearly circulated. Some nodded respectfully. Others seemed wary. Washington was a town where unexpected deviations from script were rarely welcomed. The Rose Garden was empty save for a small table set with water, coffee, and a plate of pastries. The day was unseasonably warm for early spring, sunlight dappling through newly budding trees. James stood with his hands clasped behind his back, taking in the perfectly maintained grounds, trying to process how a simple town hall question had led him here. "Colonel Wilson." The president's voice came from behind him. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." James turned to find Trump approaching alone. No aides, no press, not even the usual Secret Service detail hovering within arm's reach. They must be watching from a discreet distance, he realized. "Mr. President," James acknowledged with a nod. "I admit I'm surprised by the timing." Trump gestured to the table. "Let's sit. And call me Donald when it's just us. All this Mr. President stuff gets old after a while." It was so incongruous, sitting in the Rose Garden having coffee with the President of the United States, that James almost wanted to laugh. Instead, he took the offered seat, noting how Trump chose the chair beside him rather than across the table. A deliberate choice, he suspected, to avoid creating physical distance. "I watched the replay of our exchange about 20 times last night," Trump began, stirring sugar into his coffee. "My staff wasn't happy. They think I went off script. Showed weakness." He looked up, blue eyes sharp. "What do you think, Colonel?" "Did I show weakness?" The directness of the question caught James off guard. This wasn't the carefully managed presidential image projected on television. This was something more raw, more human. "No, sir. I don't equate listening with weakness." Trump nodded slowly. "My father didn't see it that way. In his world, you never admitted you might be wrong about anything, never apologized. That was his version of strength." He sipped his coffee, grimacing slightly at the heat. "It worked for him in real estate. Not sure it works in this job." James remained silent, sensing the president had more to say. "The polling numbers this morning are interesting," Trump continued. "My team expected backlash from my base for not being tough enough with you. Instead, approval ticked up 3 points overnight. Turns out people like seeing a real conversation, even if it's uncomfortable. People are hungry for authenticity," James offered, "on all sides." "Maybe." Trump leaned back in his chair. "Here's what I'm thinking, Colonel. Yesterday wasn't just about some comments I made. It's about a disconnect between civilians and military that's been growing for decades. Less than 1% of Americans serve now. Most people don't even know someone who's worn the uniform." James nodded. It was something he'd thought about often during his career. "So I'm proposing something," Trump continued. "A listening tour. Me, you, and a small group of veterans from different backgrounds. No press, no cameras, at least not inside the rooms. Just real conversations about service, sacrifice, what it means to wear that uniform. After, if we find some common ground, we go public together." James studied the president's face, looking for signs of political calculation. There was surely some. No one reached this office without political instinct, but there seemed to be genuine interest as well. "Why me?" James asked finally. "There are veterans organizations with far more influence. The American Legion, VFW, newer groups like Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America." Trump smiled slightly. "Because you didn't come at me with talking points or an agenda. You spoke from experience, and you did it respectfully, even though I could tell you were angry." He paused. "Also, frankly, the optics work. A black veteran and a Republican president finding common ground. That's a story that cuts through the noise." At least he was honest about the political dimensions, James thought. "I'd need to know this isn't just for show," James said carefully. "That we're actually working toward concrete changes in how veterans are supported and how military service is discussed." "Fair enough." Trump reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. Here's what I'm thinking. A 3-month commitment, 6 listening sessions around the country, and at the end we develop a joint statement of principles about how politicians, all politicians, both parties, should talk about military service. James took the paper, scanning the bullet points. It was surprisingly detailed for something apparently conceived overnight. Someone on the president's staff had been working hard. "You're moving very quickly on this," James observed. Trump shrugged. "I do everything quickly. When something works, I go with it. When it doesn't, I move on. Yesterday worked." A soft chime sounded from Trump's pocket. He checked his phone and sighed. "Security Council meeting in 5 minutes. Can't skip that one." He stood, straightening his tie. "Take the day to think about it. Talk to whoever you need to. My chief of staff will call you tomorrow for your answer." James rose as well. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. President. I'll consider it carefully." Trump extended his hand. "Whatever you decide, thank you for your honesty yesterday. It's rare in this town." As they shook hands, a photographer who had appeared from somewhere captured the moment. James realized the seemingly private conversation had been, at least in its final moments, staged for public consumption. Yet the conversation itself had felt genuine. It was a paradox he was still processing as he was escorted back through the White House, past portraits of previous presidents who had navigated their own political minefields while trying, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing to serve the greater good. Outside, the press had gathered, somehow alerted to his visit. Shouted questions followed him to the waiting car. "Colonel Wilson, was this a genuine apology from the president? Will you be joining the administration? Did the president address his past comments about veterans?" James didn't answer, sliding into the back seat as a Secret Service agent closed the door behind him. As the car pulled away from the White House, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Leaked photo of our meeting already has 100,000 retweets. People are hungry for something different. Think about it." DJT James put the phone away and watched the Washington Monument slide past the window. He had much to consider. Was this an opportunity for genuine bridge building or a sophisticated political maneuver? Perhaps both. In Washington, motivations were rarely pure, but that didn't mean good couldn't come from complicated beginnings. The car turned onto the highway, heading back to his temporarily famous home where reporters still waited. Behind him, the White House grew smaller in the rear window. That enduring symbol of American power, somehow both imposing and fragile in these divided times. Whatever he decided, James knew that the quiet retirement he had planned had just been postponed. Sometimes history called at unexpected moments, asking ordinary citizens to step into extraordinary roles. The question now was what he would do with this strange, unlooked-for opportunity that had begun with a simple, honest question on national television. The decision weighed on James through a sleepless night. By morning, his front yard hosted 5 news vans, and his phone had logged calls from 3 senators, 2 major veterans organizations, and a Hollywood producer interested in life rights. America, it seemed, was desperate to know what would happen next in this unexpected story. James sat at his kitchen table with his oldest friend, Richard Thompson, who had served alongside him for 15 years before losing his right leg in the same Kandahar operation that earned James his Silver Star. "They're using you," Richard said bluntly, pushing away his coffee mug. "You know that, right?" James nodded. "The question isn't whether they're using me. It's whether I can use the situation to actually make a difference." Richard leaned forward, his prosthetic leg tapping against the table leg. "You really think Trump gives a damn about veterans beyond photo ops? Come on, Jim, you're smarter than that." "Maybe he doesn't," James conceded. "But what if this whole thing, this accident, this viral moment, created a space where something good could happen anyway?" Richard studied his friend's face. They'd been through firefights together, had carried wounded comrades across hostile territory, had attended too many funerals. They knew each other's thinking better than anyone. "You've already decided," Richard said finally. "Haven't you?" James smiled slightly. "I think I have." The call with the White House Chief of Staff was brief and businesslike. 3 days later, James found himself on Air Force One flying to Fort Bragg, North Carolina for the first of the listening sessions. The plan had evolved, 6 locations in 6 weeks, each featuring the president and a dozen veterans from different eras and backgrounds. The small cabin section where James sat was simple but comfortable. Across from him, a White House aide named Thomas was reviewing a briefing document. "We've got World War II veterans, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan," Thomas explained. "Different ranks, different experiences. The Fort Bragg group includes 3 Purple Heart recipients and 2 former POWs. James nodded, studying his own copy of the briefing. "No press inside the meeting?" "Correct. The president was adamant about that. There'll be a photo opportunity before and a joint statement after, but the conversation itself stays private." Thomas hesitated. It was actually his idea. Said people wouldn't speak freely with cameras running. The plane began its descent, and James felt a familiar pre-mission tension. This wasn't combat, but it was territory just as unpredictable in its way. Fort Bragg welcomed them with military precision. The president arrived separately on Marine, one touching down on the parade field in a swirl of dust and noise. As James watched from a nearby building, he noted how Trump straightened his tie, set his shoulders, and switched on his public persona before the helicopter door opened. The meeting room was set up simply, a large round table with 14 chairs, water pitchers, notepads. No flags, no seals, no trappings of office. The veterans arrived first, some in wheelchairs, others walking with the straight-backed bearing that never quite leaves those who've served, regardless of age. James spoke briefly with each of them. Albert, 96, who had stormed Normandy. Catherine, who had been a nurse in Vietnam. Luis, who still carried shrapnel in his shoulder from Fallujah. Each had a story, each had sacrificed, each had questions about whether their country truly understood what that sacrifice meant. When the president entered, there was a momentary stiffness. These were men and women accustomed to showing respect for the office, regardless of who held it. They stood, those who could, and there were handshakes all around. "No titles today," Trump said, taking a seat. "No, Mr. President, no, sir, just first names. I'm Donald, and I'm here to listen." The first hour was cautious, formal. Veterans spoke of benefits issues, VA health care, transition programs for those returning to civilian life. Trump asked questions, took notes himself rather than delegating to staff. It was the standard agenda of veterans' concerns, important but familiar ground. Then Albert, the World War II veteran, cleared his throat. "You know what bothers me?" he said, his voice thin but clear. "When people who never served a day in their lives talk about war like it's a video game, like sending troops somewhere is just moving pieces on a board." The room went silent. The comment could be read as a direct criticism of Trump, who had received draft deferments during Vietnam. Trump put down his pen. "You mean people like me?" he said quietly. Albert held his gaze. "With respect, yes, people like you. People like most of our Congress, people making life and death decisions without skin in the game." James watched the president carefully, wondering if the famous temper would flare. Instead, Trump nodded slowly. "Fair point," he said. "More than fair. When I took office, I had generals brief me on what it's really like on the ground. But it's not the same as being there, is it?" "Not even close," said Luis, touching his shoulder where the shrapnel remained. "So educate me," Trump said, leaning forward. "No filters, no politics, what don't I understand?" What followed was unlike any presidential meeting in recent memory. For 3 hours, veterans spoke with raw honesty about the reality of service. The camaraderie, the fear, the pride, the trauma. The feeling of being forgotten once the uniform came off. Catherine described holding dying soldiers who called for their mothers. Luis spoke of losing his best friend to suicide after 3 tours. Richard shared the phantom pain that still woke him at night, feeling a leg that was no longer there. Trump listened more than he spoke. When he did talk, it was without the bombast that characterized his public appearances. He asked questions, admitted ignorance, occasionally pushed back, but never dismissed. James found himself reevaluating his expectations as the hours passed. Whatever political calculation had initiated this meeting, something genuine was happening within it. As the session wound down, Albert, who had started the deeper conversation, spoke again. "I don't care who's president," he said. "Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter to me at my age. But I want whoever sits in that office to talk about war, and those who fight it with the respect it deserves. To understand what they're asking when they send young people into harm's way." Trump was silent for a long moment. "I've gotten that wrong sometimes," he finally said. "The words matter. I see that now." When they emerged from the meeting, the waiting press captured images of Trump with his arm around Albert's thin shoulders, of James and the president in serious conversation, of veterans from across generations, united in a moment that transcended political divisions. The plane ride back to Washington was quiet. James sat alone watching America pass beneath him, thinking about the surprising day. Thomas eventually came to sit across from him. "The president wants you to join him for the press briefing tomorrow," he said. "He'd like you to speak about what happened today." James raised an eyebrow. "Is that wise? I'm not exactly a supporter." Thomas smiled slightly. "That's exactly why he wants you there. Said it wouldn't mean anything coming from someone already on his team." The next morning, James stood at the back of the White House briefing room, feeling out of place among the political professionals. The press secretary introduced the president, who spoke briefly about the Fort Bragg meeting before introducing James. As he stepped to the podium, James felt the intense focus of the press corps. These were people trained to look for angles, to find political strategies beneath every action. They were waiting for him to either praise or condemn the president. Instead, he chose honesty. "Yesterday wasn't about politics," he began. "It was about service and sacrifice, and whether our nation truly understands what those words mean." The president listened. Really listened. "That's a start." A reporter called out, "Do you support the president now, Colonel Wilson?" James shook his head. "This isn't about supporting or opposing. It's about finding common ground on issues that should transcend partisanship. We may not agree on many things, but we found agreement on the need to honor service appropriately, to choose our words carefully when discussing those who risk everything." Another voice. "Is this just a publicity stunt?" "I can't speak to motivations," James answered carefully. "I can only speak to actions, and yesterday's conversation was substantive and respectful. We'll see what follows from it." After the briefing, as James was preparing to leave, an aide directed him to the Oval Office. The president was waiting, standing by the window rather than behind the imposing desk. "You did well with the press," Trump said. "Better than I usually do." "I just told the truth," James replied. "That's usually the best approach, even in Washington." Trump turned from the window. "The next session is in San Antonio next week. Veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. Will you be there?" James considered all that had happened since that town hall just days ago, how a moment of confrontation had somehow opened a door to something more constructive. The cynical part of him remained wary, but another part, the part that had led men into battle believing in purpose beyond politics, saw potential. "Yes," he said. "I'll be there." As he left the White House, James noticed the protesters and supporters, facing off across the street, American flags on both sides, each claiming the true patriotism of the nation. The divides remained deep, but for a brief moment he had glimpsed the possibility of something else. Not unity, perhaps, but at least the possibility of hearing each other across the divide. His phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Saw you on TV. Still think you're being used, but you handled it well. Keep your eyes open." James smiled as he typed his reply. "Always do. But something real happened yesterday. Not sure what comes next, but I'm staying in the fight." 6 weeks passed in a whirlwind of cities, bases, and meeting rooms. San Antonio, Norfolk, San Diego, Boston, Minneapolis. In each location, James watched as veterans opened up to the president and, more surprisingly, as the president opened up to them. The final session was scheduled for Arlington National Cemetery, a choice that raised eyebrows among political commentators but made perfect sense to those involved in the process. Where better to conclude this journey than among the fallen who had given the ultimate sacrifice? The day was bright but cool, autumn painting the trees in brilliant reds and golds. A small group gathered in a private room at the cemetery's visitor center, veterans from previous sessions, senior military leaders, and a handful of White House staff. No press had been invited for this final conversation. James arrived early, taking a moment to walk among the perfectly aligned headstones that stretched across the rolling hills. So many lives, so many stories, so much sacrifice. He stopped at Section 60, where many from Iraq and Afghanistan were laid to rest. Fresh flowers marked recent visits from families still raw with grief. It's humbling, isn't it? James turned to find President Trump standing behind him, alone except for a discreet Secret Service agent keeping watch from a distance. It is, James agreed. All those lives. All that potential. Trump nodded, looking out over the endless rows of white markers. You know, I never fully understood this place before these past weeks. I'd been here for ceremonies, laid wreaths, said the right words. But it was. He paused, searching for the right term. Performative? James suggested. Yes, Trump acknowledged. Like a lot of things in politics, you go through the motions without really feeling it. He turned to face James directly. This process has been different. They walked in silence back toward the visitor center, an unlikely pair who had found unexpected common ground. Inside, the gathered veterans stood as they entered, a gesture of respect that seemed directed at them both. Let's begin, Trump said, after brief greetings. This is our last formal session, though I hope not the end of our conversations. Today I want to talk about what happens next, how we turn words into actions. For the next 2 hours, they discussed concrete steps, changes to how presidents speak about military service, new recognition programs for veterans, improved transition services for those returning to civilian life, expanded mental health resources. It was practical, specific, and notably free of partisan positioning. As the session wound down, an older veteran named William, who had served in Vietnam and attended the Boston meeting, raised his hand. Mr. President, if I may, we've talked a lot about policies and programs. Those matter. But what's mattered most about this whole process is something simpler. You listened. You didn't just defend or explain or pivot to talking points. You actually heard us. Others nodded in agreement. That shouldn't be remarkable, William continued. But in today's America it is. And regardless of what policies come from this, that listening itself has meant something. Trump was uncharacteristically quiet for a moment. It's meant something to me too, he finally said. More than I expected. He glanced at James. When Colonel Wilson stood up at that town hall, I was annoyed. Thought it was another gotcha moment. I was wrong. It was an opportunity if I was willing to take it. As the meeting concluded, the White House communications director distributed a press release outlining the initiative's outcomes. New executive orders would be signed the following week. Legislative proposals would be sent to Congress. A permanent Veterans Advisory Council would be established, with James among its members. There's a press conference scheduled for 2, the communications director explained. We've got the major networks, print media, digital outlets. The president would like Colonel Wilson to join him at the podium. James raised an eyebrow. To say what exactly? Whatever you believe to be true, Trump interjected, overhearing the exchange. No script, no talking points. Just your honest assessment of whether this process has been worthwhile. It was a risk, James realized. He wasn't a supporter, had never claimed to be. His words wouldn't necessarily align with the administration's preferred narrative. I can do that, he said finally. The East Room of the White House was packed with journalists, cameras clicking and lights blazing as Trump approached the podium, James slightly behind him. The president spoke first, outlining the initiative's outcomes in his usual direct style, though with notably less bombast than his typical public appearances. Then he stepped aside, gesturing for James to take his place. A hush fell over the room. This was the moment many had been waiting for. Would the respected veteran offer a full endorsement, or would he distance himself now that the project was complete? James adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. 6 weeks ago, I asked President Trump a difficult question during a town hall. It wasn't planned. I simply spoke from my experience as someone who has served this country for most of my adult life. What followed has been unexpected in every way. He paused, gathering his thoughts. I want to be clear about something. This process hasn't erased our differences. The president and I still disagree on many issues. I haven't become a supporter overnight, and he hasn't suddenly adopted my worldview. From the corner of his eye, James could see White House staffers shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't the ringing endorsement they had hoped for. But something important has happened, he continued. We found a space where those disagreements could be set aside to focus on values we do share. Respect for service, concern for those who have sacrificed, commitment to caring for veterans beyond political talking points. The room was completely silent now, journalists leaning forward, sensing that this was not the usual Washington script. In a nation that feels increasingly divided, where we struggle to hear each other across our differences, that matters. It matters deeply. James's voice grew stronger. If we can listen to each other about something as fundamental as how we honor service and sacrifice, perhaps we can listen to each other about other things too. He turned slightly toward Trump. Mr. President, I want to thank you for doing something politicians rarely do. Listening without immediately defending, hearing criticism without dismissing it, and being willing to evolve your thinking. That takes a different kind of courage than what we see on battlefields. But it's courage nonetheless, Trump nodded. A gesture of respect rather than agreement. To my fellow veterans, James continued, facing the cameras again, I want you to know that your voices have been heard in these sessions. Not filtered, not sanitized, but heard in all their complexity. The policies announced today reflect your experiences and needs, not political calculations. He straightened his shoulders. The bearing of a military officer evident even in civilian clothes. And to my fellow Americans, I want to say this. Our nation faces profound challenges that transcend party lines. We won't solve them by shouting past each other or refusing to acknowledge when those we disagree with get something right. The easy path is to stay in our corners, comfortable in our certainties. The harder path, the path of true citizenship, is to engage across our differences, to listen especially when it's difficult, and to find common ground wherever possible. James stepped back from the microphone, his part complete. Trump returned to the podium, and for a moment, the two men stood side by side, different in almost every way, yet united in this unexpected collaboration. The questions that followed were predictable. Was this a political calculation? Would James be joining the administration? Was this the beginning of a broader attempt to reach across partisan lines? Through it all, James maintained his balance, acknowledging the progress made without overstating it, giving credit where due without surrendering his independence, remaining hopeful without becoming naive. As the press conference ended, Trump shook his hand firmly. You're a straight shooter, Colonel. Not sure that always works in politics, but it should. James smiled slightly. In or out of uniform, it's the only way I know how to be. Later that evening, as James walked down the steps of the White House for what might be the last time, his phone buzzed with a text from Richard. Watch the press conference. You didn't compromise yourself. Proud of you, brother. James smiled as he typed his reply. Never intended to. Some battles are fought with weapons, others with words. Either way, integrity matters most. As his car pulled away from the White House gates, James watched the iconic building recede in the rear window, its lights glowing warmly against the darkening sky. The American flag flew above it, a reminder of what united the nation even in times of bitter division. The past 6 weeks had been unexpected in every way, a journey that began with confrontation and ended with something not quite friendship, but perhaps understanding. In a political landscape that rewarded absolutism and punished nuance, they had found a narrow path toward something more constructive. Would it last? James wasn't naive enough to believe that a few weeks of listening sessions could heal the deep divisions in American society. Politics would continue, parties would clash, disagreements would remain, but something had shifted, if only slightly. A door had opened, showing the possibility of engagement across differences. For a moment, they had glimpsed an America where listening mattered more than shouting, where common ground could be found even among those who disagreed on most things. It wasn't a Hollywood ending, no complete transformations, no perfect solutions. Just human beings, with all their flaws and complexities, finding a way to hear each other across the divide. In these divided times, perhaps that small victory was enough to build upon.